Stuart is a co-founder of Aligned AI. His background is a PhD in math at Oxford. He's a mentor for the Foresight Institute, an advisor for the AI Safety Camp. He's been thinking about AI safety for a while. The first time I visited Oxford, he was sitting there in a room scribbling diagrams of things that I kind of understood. He was a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute and has been working on AI alignment since before most of us knew that that was a thing. So without further ado, Stuart.
This is on human values and value extrapolation. Some people have said that it should be a technical talk, but it's not a technical talk. It's going to be essentially a pre-technical talk, which is explaining the reasons why we're doing the specific technical research that we are, and sketching out the beginning of a path towards aligned AGI. So this started some years ago. As you said, I'm in the, I'd say, second and a half generation of AI researchers. And so I've been thinking about this for over a decade. And somebody has said that almost of all of AI alignment is concept extrapolation. And I trust their judgment because it was me. I also, on the same occasion, said that almost all of AI is ontology shift, almost all of AI is a Goodhart law problem, and almost all of AI alignment is generalization. Goodhart law problems? That's when everyone talks about the Soviet Union as the extreme example of this. It's when it's when the proxy measure no longer corresponds to the reality. If you want to check that your nail-making factories are working well, you could sort of just weigh how many nails they produce. That gives you an idea of their production. But if you motivate the manager by that metric, then suddenly they produce huge masses of nails of no interest or use to anybody. So as soon as you target a measure or a proxy measure, it ceases to become a useful measure. But the reason I think that all these are essentially the core of AI alignment is that I think that in a fundamental way, they're all the same thing, or at least at a loose enough definition they are. And the intuition came because one of the things I have a lot of experience of is trying to destroy other people's brilliant ideas. There have been a lot of people who have come to me with ideas saying, this will solve alignment. And generally, there's potential and we can dig into it. But I generally first have to point out, no, it won't solve alignment on its own, as is for these reasons. And after a while, it started to feel quite samey, as in I felt I was saying the same thing, even though the ideas were different and my objection was different. So it took me a while to try and hone in on what was the common feature that I was always finding. And that, I think, is what I found. The common problem seems to be that when defining or quantifying a concept, it is very easy for humans to point at typical examples or posit a law or a proxy that is valid in typical situations. Alex Turner had a variant of AI power, a description of power. I'm picking on this example because it was one of the hardest for me to break. But it was a formalization of you're powerful if you don't have the ability to modify utility much or different utilities much. And you can perfectly see the inspiration of it. Powerful people can change the world in whatever direction they want. Less powerful people can't. It's a good idea, and the formalization was good. but it failed in unusual circumstances. For example, you could do a similar one if I had someone that followed me around and I could give them advice and they would do it. I could ensure that I never technically had enough power or money or whatever is according to this metric, but this would still allow me indirectly to have a huge amount of power in the world. So the issue is that we can find a definition, a proxy, a law, or a list of examples in typical situations of what we want. If we want low power, if we want AIs that grant happiness, if we want algorithms to respect our choices, all those sort of things. But first of all, it is very hard for humans to figure out the range of validity of those examples or laws. We don't have a good intuitive grasp for when it'll all break. This is Diogenes, who allegedly, when Plato defined humans as featherless biped, plucked a chicken and held it up saying, behold Plato's man. Plato then allegedly amended the definition to a featherless biped with broad flat nails. What was happening here was, it wasn't that Plato or Diogenes or anyone was confused about what the definition of man or chicken or human being was. It was just that the formalization was insufficient. But there's another part to this, which is it is tricky for humans or algorithms to extend them to novel situations. Like suppose we want to ensure human flourishing. Well, the question is, what do we do with chimps, for example, in this optic? It's underdefined. We can think of ways that we can extend it to chimpanzees or not, but it's not intrinsic in our initial definitions. And so this is what I'm thinking the common problem in most of alignment, that alignment is trying to solve in different areas, which is we have these lists of examples where we're sure things are good or bad. We can construct proxies, we can construct laws for them in typical situations. But first of all, we don't really know whether we got the law correctly. And second of all, we're not sure how to extend it to novel situations. An example of the second would be the example we had earlier today about the Jewish doctor with the Christian mother giving childbirth and whether to save the baby or the mother. When I saw that example, I immediately started noting it down to do it here, because that is a good example of something where we can come to a conclusion, but we don't come to an immediate conclusion. What we're doing is we're extending our previous moral intuitions to a new area, piecing it together. How does this go with this, or what should supervene over what? So it's constructing a moral judgment for a new situation. And that's the kind of skill that we would want in algorithms in order to solve the alignment ultimately. So it is applied to most of AI safety. The main exceptions being it may not apply to some versions of inner alignment and versions of logical uncertainty. But you can see all of these, like the hidden complexity of wishes. If you have a genie, your mother's in a burning house. This is an example from Eliezer Yudkowsky. And you wish, get my mother out of the house as fast as possible. Then, well, the house explodes and you see the charred corpse of your mother shooting up at a supersonic speed into the upper atmosphere. The problem is that save my mother, when you normally utter that, you utter it in situations where all the agents know exactly what you mean, and where the possibility of exploding the house to get your mother up not only doesn't occur to most people, but is actually impossible for most people to do. The Goodhart problem, so remember I was saying that Goodhart problems is one of the ways of saying one of the things that everything in AI is. Well, here it's that we have, in typical situations, the proxy we define, the measure that we've defined, is the same thing as desired behavior. But when we go off distribution, when we go to new environments, it breaks. The typical, non-typical environments, it's no longer the same thing. So yes, I'm not going to read every single one of those. I'll just leave it for a few seconds if you want to have a look at your favorite. And a minor caveat here, I'm saying that it's applicable to most of AI safety. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that the only way of doing AI safety is to solve this problem directly. Like if you can solve corrigibility or iterated distillation and amplification, Paul Cristiano's main approach, you might solve all of alignment already there without solving the general problem of extrapolating necessarily. But that being said, what we're focusing on, what Aligned AI, the company, and what my research on is trying to solve this extrapolation problem. And now let's take a brief side tour into human values and human irrationality. So this is a connection back to my no free lunch in value learning, or Occam's razor is insufficient in value learning paper. You could have a superintelligent AI by any definition of superintelligent that have all the world's video feeds, all of Wikipedia, all social science research, perfect predictions of human behavior, perfectly able to manipulate humans, and it could still conclude that humans are fully rational in everything that we do. And it would not be wrong. So what is this thing? Well, the problem is that disentangling motive and rationality involves judgment that you can't just see by looking at behavior or even looking inside the algorithm. So this is a nice example that Rebecca came up with. I see that you have taken up smoking, thinks the AI. Obviously, what you're trying to achieve is lung cancer, and I can recommend asbestos. And maybe it feels that it shouldn't disturb you with questions all the time, so just sneak in some asbestos where you can breathe it easily and help you on your way towards lung cancer. The problem being here that we know, or at least we model ourselves and other humans, as the lung cancer is an undesired side effect of the smoking. Virtually no one takes up smoking to get lung cancer. I say virtually no one because there's probably one person somewhere. But in general, this is not the case. But instead of seeing this as a stupid limitation or a limitation or stupidity or a bias of humans, we could model it as, well, they are pursuing their reward, which obviously includes lung cancer, and it is just as easy to model it that way as it is to model it in a more reasonable way. In fact, the simplest explanations of human behavior are generally humans are fully rational, humans are fully anti-rational, and humans have no preferences. The way of modeling this, to get into a little bit of the technical thing, you have a reward function, you have a planner, it's a map from reward functions to policies, and what we can observe is only the policy. And only that is what we observe of people. The argument still works if we can look into people's brains, so we can observe the algorithm, but let's just stick with assuming we can only observe the policy for the moment. And we now apply a simplicity prior, and the planner S and the reward RS are the simplest pair compatible with our observation of the policy. Then one thing we can do with this pair is produce the policy. By definition, they're compatible with the policy, so if you apply that planner to that reward, you get the policy. And from the policy, you can produce the three reward functions planner pairs that I described before. The top one, PG, is the greedy planner, and R pi is the reward that gives you 1 for doing the action that you're going to do under pi, and 0 otherwise. The negatives of this is the anti-greedy policy with the negative of that reward. And then we have the planner P pi, which is ignore your reward function, do what the policy pi tells you. These are completely degenerate solutions. But the thing is that their complexity is very comparable with the one that we started with for most computer languages, and I dare to say for any reasonable computer language. Because here, all you've done is you have two objects, you've applied one to the other to get the policy, and then you have constructed from that policy this simple reward function or this complicated reward function, but it is easy to build from that policy. R pi is complicated, but given pi, it is just a question of looking what the action that it advocates for. And so the Kolmogorov complexity for most languages, and most computer languages, will be comparable. What that means is that these three, the humans are fully rational, they're fully anti-rational, and they have flat preferences, float towards the bottom of the simplicity hierarchy when you look at possible interpretations of human behavior. And let's now have a look at the real pair. Suppose we have the real planner, i.e. the rationality of a human and their real reward. What does this encode? Well, for a start, it encodes every cognitive bias that humans ever have, which you can see as the difference between what the human actually does and what they would do under ideal circumstances. None of the ones that I've defined to you before have any concept of cognitive bias. The perfectly rational is always rational, bias is 0. The anti-rational, well, bias is maximal. And the last one, the reward is 0, everything it does is equivalent. But here, from a true or a real pair, we have all the concepts of cognitive biases. So there requires a certain amount of extra bits in order to define something reasonable. Now, what it tends to come down to when we get into real discussions about this is how many bits extra. Can you just get away with sort of a simple assumption, add it to and say, well, yes, but obviously if you take into account what humans say in relaxed situations or something like that, then you can tell what they want, or get some human to list a theory of mind and use that. So is there a lot in this gulf, or is there only a little? Well, I don't know. I tend to think that there's a lot. A lot of other people tend to think there's not much. But what it means for learning is that one must use semi-supervised learning for human values. Just unsupervised learning is not enough. If, with all the data that you have, you need to rank at least some situations as positive or negative, it won't be able to infer what we want just by observing what we do. There's also something that might help with this, which is grounded cached knowledge, which is that we have written a lot of things about psychology. Google has been devoted to giving us what we want, and there's certain definitions of want. GPT-3 encodes a lot of, well, writings about psychology, how humans judge other situations. So if we can ground these concepts, the concepts of GPT-3 and the meaning of the terms in psychology papers, we might just be able to point the AI at there and say, follow that. So when I said we needed a certain amount of extra bits, it might be that just the bits that you need is just to point the AI to where we have already stored all this information. Now, this, I think, is a very interesting argument, and people have had arguments with me about it, and we can go into great depth about it. And now I want to say that it's not really very relevant at all. The reason that it's not very relevant, so the reason I brought it up is to show some of the complexities in this area and the assumptions you need to make. But the reason it is less relevant than you think is because it is trying to assign the preferences of a perfect agent, and humans are not a perfect agent. Here are two false statements. The first false statement is that humans have preferences. It's a ridiculous statement, laughable. The second false statement is that humans have no preferences. This is obviously also ridiculous and laughable. The truth is that we are a particular type of agent, and we're not preference or utility-based agents. But we're not completely random agents either. We have some features of utility and preference-based agents, and we're lacking others. So one example of things that we have that look like preferences, we have aversions and inclinations. Some things that we want, some things that we move away from. We have preferences in mental models. We can imagine being in front of a stage with everybody wildly applauding and carrying you through the street because of the particularly fun quip that we made or something like that. Or we can imagine ducking behind the podium as the entire audience throws their laptops at me to try and, because the talk was so bad. And I can imagine those two futures and say that I prefer one of them to the other. We don't even need to articulate it often. It's often obvious within our mind. But I can also give you a description. I've just given you a description there, and you can imagine yourself in there and which preference it is. Descriptions are just another type of mental model, but it's one that we tend to use quite a lot. Sorry, descriptions trigger a mental model, or and we have the physical correlates of that, especially aversions and inclinations. So some people say maximize happiness, and one of the justifications of that is that things that we want and things that we like tend to have at least some overlap, and it might be much easier to measure happiness or liking or some version of that than to measure actual preferences. But maybe the most fascinating and interesting thing for humans that can serve as an input to figure out what human values actually are is that we have opinions on our own preferences and others. We have models. This is something really unique, really interesting for an agent that doesn't have full preferences. We have strong opinions about the fact that we do have preferences, how and why our rationality fails, for instance. In going back to that smoker example, we think that is a failure of rationality or of discipline, and that definitely she isn't starting smoking to get lung cancer. That's an unwanted side effect. So we have a judgment on her behavior and her rationality, and this judgment is pretty consistent from human to human. We have ideas of what constitutes a preference change. Like when people grow up, they often change a lot of their preferences, and we model this as a preference change. We could just say that you have one consistent preference that is conditional on your age or something like that, but we don't. We have ideas about balancing preferences. We have ideas about endorsing our preferences. Like some people talk about preferences, others are values. In a sense, the difference between a preference and a value is our judgment of it. We think values are particularly important, whereas preferences don't have to be. So we have meta judgments over our preferences. So the challenge is to take all this mess that is humanity, that is not a preference-based agent, but is also not a preference-based agent, and distill this into something that represents some version of our utility. I say some idealized version, but idealized gives the impression that it should be simple to establish. But going from that mess to something good is going to be quite tricky. So this is fundamentally a constructive process in a sense. We have the basic building blocks. We have this agent. We have the objective. By the way, I could not find good utility function photos online. The best I could find was this one about marginal utility of slices of pizza. So this is, and you might realize that this is a version of the problem that I talked about in the beginning. If you want to model us as having preferences, then in typical situations, we have preferences, or we can point to situations where we have preferences. There are lots of examples of humans having preferences. The challenge is to extend this to new situations. So this is just a reminder of that common problem into which this fits. So the problem of value learning for humans of learning human values or constructing human values is one example of this common problem. So what we're trying to aim for is a form of solution to the whole problem of extrapolation. And I tended to talk a lot about model splintering in the past. Model splintering is when key features or concepts in a world model break, and concept extrapolation is extending these concepts across a model break. One example here is that the kind of Enlightenment inherited reasoning that could write all men are created equal did lead, after a lot of social changes, to votes for women, even though this is almost certainly not exactly what was thought of at the time. The concept of equality was extended and survived across different ways of viewing the world. So what do we see as an example of concept extrapolation? What we want to do is that it approximates previous preferences. We don't want to lose everything as we distill this or extrapolate our preferences. After all, because this is what we're building up from. We want to obey implicit preferences not articulated in the previous environment. This is sort of the challenge of, I do not want to become a Nazi or a robot or a Nazi robot, for example. I've stated it now, but I don't go around saying things like that. It's sort of obvious that I don't want my preferences to extrapolate in that particular way. But it is plausible that someone could plot a course of action where, for the things I do articulate, like say freedom of thought, and then get the right input to transform me into pretty much anything that the AI could do. So we don't just want the evidence of what is seen in typical environments, but also what our judgment, the unseen pieces of our judgment as well. And then there's the suitably simple and conservative in extrapolation. When we get to areas like population ethics is my example here. There's a conclusion called the repugnant conclusion that some philosophers have forced themselves to accept, which is that if we have a wonderful world full of trillions of really, 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 really happy people, then there's a world that is much better where everybody's life is barely worth living, and the only things in the world are Muzak and potatoes, but there are trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of these people, hence much, much better as an outcome to aim for. Some people endorse that. Not many accept the very repugnant conclusion, which is that there is an even better world where trillions and trillions of people are being hideously tortured, but this is compensated by enough Muzak and potatoes, barely worth living lives to make it come into balance. And I think that accepting that is a failure of extrapolation, because I had a repugnant reaction to both of them, and most people do the first time they have it. And then they distill it out into some system sometimes where that repugnance goes away. What that means is that you have multiple judgments, and you've erased one of them in service of other ones, sometimes simplicity or elegance. And I would like the extrapolation system to not necessarily be very unwilling to just erase parts of our values, even if they seem to contradict other parts, because that seems to lead in very dangerous directions to, well, not being basically human anymore, for example. But I developed a mathematical formalism. I'll post it on Less Wrong if you want to have a look at it. But it's not that I'm unsatisfied with it, it's that I don't think that the mathematical formalism is the key here. It's the technical research on how AIs and humans extrapolate. How am I doing for time?
36.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll slow down a little bit. Okay, yes. There's a sort of natural break point to take questions after the next slide. So what we're doing is technical research on how AIs and humans extrapolate. You could say that it's on how AIs fail to extrapolate and how humans kind of succeed. Kinda. So this is an example of AI failures. Extrapolating a distinction versus a definition. So imagine, ignore the white laptop, it is a failure of the animation pane. You've encountered lots of dogs in your life, in your typical environment. They're all small and black. And they are the only black things in your starting environment. And in this environment, E0, there are the S to the power of E0 is what is your definition of what a dog is? And that's you see all the dogs that you have seen, and you sort of extrapolate, okay, this is what a dog is, this is what I expect a dog to do, to be like. And then there is the DSE0, which is the distinction, which is how do I classify dogs versus non-dogs. And this is what we tend to ask algorithms to do, the second one, the distinguish one. Now, if you're thinking to my previous slides, this is the moment where you should think of plucked chickens. Because this is a definition, this is a distinction, but we can bring in counterexamples. In fact, let's just extend to a larger environment where we encounter more things. We encounter lots of other dogs, not just black ones and not just small ones. And we encounter black objects that are not small black objects that are not dogs. A natural extrapolation of the definition that we started with includes all the dogs in this new environment. It's okay, it's not like all the dogs I've seen, but it's clearly a dog. We should draw the boundary here. The natural extrapolation of the distinction is we look for small black objects, because that is what has always worked so far. And it tends to be that algorithms extrapolate the distinction and not the definition. So this is I'm not saying anything new here. It's just sort of a rephrasing of the fact that algorithms tend to focus in on the narrowest feature that you need to split the classes the way that you want it to be split. But I think this is a productive way of seeing it. Now, most of the rest of the talk is just going to be showing some examples of how humans extrapolate our preferences more or less badly. So if now is maybe a good moment to take a few questions. Or we can wait till...
This seems like it only solves, yesterday, talking about inner alignment versus outer alignment. This only seems to solve outer alignment.
Yes.
Okay.
I did mention inner alignment as one of the things that this didn't solve. But I also think it's slightly more complicated, because you can't really say, once you've solved outer alignment, inner alignment will remain a problem. The reason you can't quite say that is because a lot depends on how you solve outer alignment. And there are some problems in inner alignment that this can directly solve, like if your inner alignment problem is a failure of correct extrapolation, then just apply these directly. But there are other versions of inner alignment that it doesn't have anything to do with. Okay. Then let's, other Stuart.
Okay, would it be okay to go back to the issue of identifiability of preferences and process? Could you explain how, let's say I have a checkers playing program, and it's got a very efficient processor, and it runs minimax, it knows the definition of winning, at every whatever board state you give it, just solves the game and gives you the correct move. So can you explain to me how it's equally good to describe that system as having no preferences, and I simply have to list all the moves it makes? Or
I mean,
I'm missing something.
Yes, the way of describing it as having no preferences is seeing it as an algorithm that executes a particular program, and it's, if you want, in the 3 degenerate example, the fully rational, the preference part expands to eat the whole of the algorithm. In the no preferences, the preference part shrinks to practically nothing. So yes, the way to describe that as having no preferences is to just see it as an algorithm that executes something, and regardless of an input that it might not get. Sorry, that last sentence was not entirely clear. Okay, here's a variant of the chess program. It looks at a reward function and then executes the algorithm that you've described, whatever the reward function is. That would be a way of describing a algorithm with no preferences, or that doesn't care about its preferences. Then conceptually, the actual chess program is just a version of that doesn't even look at a hypothetical reward function.
Okay, so you would say, yes, it has an algorithm that is maximizing defeating the opponent, but it doesn't have any preferences. It just seems like an odd way to describe what you just described as something that's maximizing an objective. You're just saying, well, it's maximizing this, but it's not an objective, it's something else. But whatever it is it's maximizing doesn't count as the objective. That's sort of what you're saying. Is this just sophistry, or is it real?
Well, if I can just modify your example maybe a bit. Well, not even modify it. Let's just assume it does alpha-beta pruning. So it's not perfectly rational. Alpha-beta pruning is not perfect. It uses a heuristic function. The heuristic function is, alpha-beta pruning with a non-perfect heuristic.
Okay.
And now trying to say whether it is trying to do chess but doing it badly, but doing it imperfectly. Okay, I feel I'm not answering the question well.
Okay, we could talk about it afterwards. We can hash it out if you wish.
Okay, just give me 5 seconds to think if I can have a... Okay, yes. The agent has preferences because we choose to model it as having preferences, and that's a useful way for us to model it as having preferences. If we just have the algorithm, it may take us some time to realize what it's doing, or that actually what it's doing is playing chess with a certain chance of winning. And from our perspective, compressing it into its wants to win, or its goal is to win, is an informative compression because we can't follow its way all down the tree branch. If we were a superintelligence looking at it, then it might be equally fruitful to just model it by exactly what it will do in every circumstance. Model it as we would model a rock rolling downhill, because we can see what it's doing. The rock rolling downhill, you could say it really wants to minimize action, like everything in the world, or you could just see it as inert and following that. So our modeling of this chess program, so modeling it as having a goal is helpful for us. But it's not the right model. It doesn't want to win at chess. If we start moving the pieces away on the board, if we go and try and unplug it, it will not resist at these things. There are a lot of things that it does that are not the same as wanting to win at chess. It's only within the restricted world where we model the chess game specifically, and certain commands can happen and certain things don't happen. Within that world, we can model it as wanting to win chess. But yes, we should talk about that a bit more afterwards. Yes?
So I have a comment and a question. The comment is that I have actually developed a mathematical framework for identifying preferences of policies based on Kolmogorov complexity, which avoids your no-free lunch theorem, but we should probably discuss it afterwards because it's just too complicated, but also a question about the previous slide with the dog and the small black thing. So you're saying that, well, that a typical machine learning algorithm would learn to identify small black things because that's simpler than dogs, and probably extrapolate it as small black things, but humans would extrapolate it as dogs, if I understood you correctly. But it seems to me that humans who only saw small black dogs would not necessarily identify other types of dogs as the same thing. It's like if if you suddenly met a human who was green and had 6 arms, then maybe you wouldn't call it a human, you would call it something else. So it's like not obvious what's the horizontal extrapolation. I'm not sure whether that's actually a unique or natural way to extrapolate.
It is non-unique and may depend on the order in which you encounter things in the bigger environment. Like I was in, if your environment extrapolation includes small black dogs with white patches, small black dogs with bigger white patches, white dogs with black patches, slightly larger black dogs, slightly larger than that black dogs, and things of that nature, then the natural extrapolation there tends to be to include them all, because there is no clear boundary to be drawn within this category and a very clear one to draw around it. But I had a point that this is not necessarily transitive, because if you encounter something where, if you find things that are small black dogs plus St. Bernards and plus wolves, that's your experience. So forget the intermediate ones there, small black dogs, St. Bernards, and wolves. In that case, there is kind of 2 natural boundaries to draw. The first one is just keep the small black dogs, and the second one is have all 3. There is a very real sense in which St. Bernards are weirder from the small black box perspective than wolves are. And so there is a certain contingency, there is a dependency on what you encounter first. And this is one of the things that we're looking at. Okay, let's accelerate. Humans tend to have strong underdefined preferences. As if they have strong preferences over things that they can't define. And one example is consider a Croatian communist, Yugoslav nationalist of the 1980s. This person can have strong preferences, and there's nothing contradictory in what they believe. But by the 1990s, everything will have got more complicated. All the things that sort of went together have broken apart. And they probably will have managed the transition better than an AI would have, which is the interesting thing. Human failure modes are not the sort of AI failure modes. Here are some examples from the past of things that have completely splintered. Honor is vital. People in lots of places have the belief that honor is very important, that it's a thing you can almost feel, it's almost real, and very important, and that one must maximize it, obviously. If you look at a definition of what honor is, it's a long list of things: propensity to violence, certain amounts of chastity, keeping promises, that kind of don't really make sense together, and different honor cultures differ in a lot of places. So if you had if you had Archimedes with his AI and programmed in honor is vital, what would it have become in today's world? We want it to become something because we don't want it to throw away our values, but it's not clear what it should become. Victorian middle class values, woman should be protected. This value depended on a particular time and situation, and it makes a lot of sense in that environment. You should not go back to the Victorian middle class and say, no, 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 don't protect women, that's terrible. It will make, because if you do that, it'll make things a lot worse. But obviously, this kind of thing has extrapolated poorly to nowadays. The social role of women has changed, and as it did, the whole idea of what should be done has changed. So this, and at the moment, we're also seeing gender itself being questioned. So the very basis from which this definition came is falling apart. But it fell apart a long, long time ago when women started to be able to vote, to own property in their own names. All those sort of changes meant that this sort of Victorian value is quite obsolete. But if you had a steam engine AI and you programmed this into it, what would you want it to have become? And today, you have things like happiness is important, and I think happiness is going to break the same way the previous concepts have broken. Yeah, there's going to be different features of it, they're going to fall apart, but I think happiness is important, and we should preserve it, and we should program it in a way that something of this is extrapolated and extended. Another example, children, well-behaved children, which Huckleberry Finn was not, but well-behaved children in well-ordered societies can sometimes make it till teenagerhood before they realize that there's a difference between lawful and good in D&D terms. It's always been the same thing for them before. The good thing to do was the lawful thing to do. This is an example of Huckleberry Finn, who's decided that he will not betray the escaped slave that he's traveling with, even though that is the moral thing to do in his society. And we manage this transition. We might become more lawful, we might become more good, we can do a lot of things in between. But again, humans manage these transitions better than AIs do. Now, this is the famous trolley problem, but it's not the problem itself. I want you to think to the first time you encountered it, and the tension that you may have felt, that I felt, between realizing that the good action, the nice action, is not the best action in terms of best for the world. We live in a society that really goes out of its way to hide this from us or not make us face difficult choices between being nice and being good. But when we encounter that, we have the tension. And this is the kind of thing that is going to happen to all our values in the future if we go to extreme situations. There is going to be that tension, and it has to be resolved somehow. If the standard trolley problem is old hat for you, there are a variety of trolley problems that you can find online. Just put more and more complications or subtleties or trade-offs until you get to the point where you can think, okay, it's not clear what I have to do, I have to figure out what it is. And we would want an AI to be able to figure out, at least as well as us, what happens there. There might not be a correct answer, but there are a lot of stupid answers, and we want the AIs to avoid that. Sorry, a lot of wrong answers, and we want the AIs to avoid that. Then, an example shamelessly stolen from this morning. Jewish doctor, Christian mother, one of them's got to die. Do you save the mother or the child? Again, we can think of lots of arguments. Kill the doctor was a surprising solution to that. Kill both would be another solution, but we don't want the AI to emerge on either of those. Another example is, suppose someone creates a willing slave species who want to be slaves, but they don't enjoy it. This is the Ood from Doctor Who, if you want the background on those. If someone created such a thing, how would we deal with this species? Where some of the strongest things that we believe, which is people should be able to be what they want to be, people shouldn't be slaves, and wanting and liking are at least somewhat related to each other, when those come apart. Again, because the AI may be able to foresee and cause these situations to happen or not happen, it has to be able to extrapolate, at least as well as we can. And so to bring it back to the beginning, if we want the AI to ensure human flourishing, and both human and flourishing, we only have some examples and some rules of thumbs about what they mean. Some examples, some proxies. And we want it to be able to extrapolate those concepts for us. And that's what we're doing at Aligned AI with a 4-step program. The first one is solve concept extrapolation, no biggie. But I think that it's actually possible to make progress on this, and we have been making a lot of progress both at the technical level and some at the philosophical level. Then define human values. The one advantage of this more constructive approach is that we don't need to define human values perfectly, and I think it's actually dangerous to think of defining human values perfectly, because there isn't a perfect construction of human values from the mess that is the human agent. And I think trying to get perfection or looking for it can make us too willing to destroy large parts of human values to achieve it. And then we have safe AIs, and we will sell them to people. We'll be doing this before. The company does not require that we solve the full alignment problem before we have a product. And last, profit, of course. So in conclusion, there seems to be a universal problem in AI alignment. The problem is the definitions and concepts don't generalize. Concept extrapolation could resolve this. I should have put could instead of can. It's a bit more modest, and the aligned AI aims to solve this. So